Well, let's go to the foyer of the House of Commons and talk more about the federal response. You see Patty Hajdu, Canada's Minister of Indigenous Services. Minister Hajdu, good to have you on the show.
It's great to be here with you.
Now, we have some overall national numbers on fires and evacuations. What can you tell us about the current situation for Indigenous communities?
Yeah, so about 17 Indigenous communities, First Nations communities, have been affected by wildfires this season, and 13 are still evacuated, about 6,300 people. Some people have gone back to community, about 1,000 or so, but there are still a lot of people displaced from their homes and communities. Chiefs and community leaders, Indigenous firefighters have been working incredibly hard with provinces, territories, and of course with the federal government to protect lives, but also to protect critical infrastructure that, as many First Nations know, is very difficult to rebuild in some of the more remote communities.
So I know that obviously different communities are in different situations right across Canada. What are your department's main priorities on the ground right now?
So the department is there to really support First Nations leadership in the decisions that they make, and oftentimes it is about, for example, evacuating, first of all, usually vulnerable people, people with health conditions, people that have challenges breathing in the best of times, young children or elderly people, and then, of course, supporting those evacuees with a variety of different kinds of supports, including financial supports and mental health supports. The Government of Canada, under our leadership, transformed the emergency management program, actually through the experience of COVID and reports by the Auditor General, and just in time for fire season. So communities have full financial flexibility to do this work, but we're there with them if they're having cash flow challenges. We also provide a variety of different levels of expertise, both on protecting of community infrastructure, but largely in terms of the human resources needed from a healthcare and a mental health care perspective.
I want to ask you then about that support, about that emergency management program, because your government is calling this an unprecedented season for wildfires, and we can all see that from the images we've been seeing from across Canada. So what is the cost, not just for evacuating, but for long-term rebuilding in these communities? Because there are also a lot of economic livelihoods being affected. Do you have a dollar figure yet on what this is going to cost?
We don't have a dollar figure, and the terrifying thing is that it is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We don't necessarily have a precise number because communities are still in the current stage of responding to the tremendous pressure to evacuate people, to protect infrastructure, to do some of that firefighting that could protect communities. But you're absolutely right. It's going to be very expensive to rebuild. We've reassured communities that we will be there with them as they plan that rebuilding process and as they begin that hard work. Some communities have been deeply affected, others not so much, but all communities will have an impact to their traditional ways of life. For example, you know, if your community is in the middle of a forest fire that's been burnt out, so to speak, it disrupts the pattern of animal behavior, it disrupts the traditional medicines and territory that you've become accustomed to and that you know so well, and there's a huge devastating grief associated with that, which exacerbates the mental health conditions that obviously many First Nations people live with right now. So this is a costly problem. It's a significantly sorrowful time for First Nations communities, and there is an economic prosperity angle in that many communities rely on the forests for their livelihoods, whether it is through tourism or through engagement with the forestry industry.
Okay, I want to turn to housing now. On Monday, the NDP's Blake Desjardins called for immediate housing support to affected First Nations and Métis settlements. What can you say about that part of your response?
Well, housing has been a critical need in First Nations even prior to this wildfire season, and the Government of Canada has invested historic sums to try to begin to close the housing gap. In total, at this point, roughly $8 billion has been dedicated to building housing on First Nations, and with First Nations leadership, we, as you know, have money set aside in Budget 23 for urban, rural, and northern housing that's Indigenous focused and led. So that work is is ongoing. I can tell you, though, in terms of the rebuild, what our commitment has been is that we will replace with First Nations the housing that's been lost as a result of forest fires. And my focus as a Minister of Indigenous Services will be to, first of all, help communities assess what that gap is, determine the price tag that we'll need to come up with in terms of off-cycle funding. This is not budgeted amounts. This is the money that we will need to go and seek in between budget cycles to help communities begin that work. And thirdly, I'll say that there'll be some staging challenges because, of course, we're not just talking about housing, we're talking about other critical infrastructure that could be damaged, whether it's power, water delivery. It's hard to tell. And the communities affected will be doing that assessment with the support from the engineering team and the technical teams at Indigenous Services Canada.
Okay, and I also want to ask you about firefighting capacity. There's been a lot of talk as these fires have spread about the possibility of a national fire service. Does Canada have enough firefighters? The government does have agreements now to train hundreds of new Indigenous firefighters, a program that your colleague, the Natural Resources Minister, says will incorporate Indigenous knowledge. So what can you tell us about the timeline for that plan, and how is it going to differ from other firefighter training?
Well, first of all, the national approach to fighting fires is one that is collaborative with First Nations and provinces and territories. And provinces and territories, as you know, have the emergency management teams, including wildfire firefighters and teams of individuals that respond to fire season every single year. But what Minister Wilkinson's announcement acknowledges is that it is often in remote communities First Nations firefighters that are on the front line, and we need more. And we actually need, as Minister Wilkinson pointed out, to tap into the expertise of Indigenous peoples in terms of protecting ourselves, our country, from the increasing threat of wildfires. Indigenous peoples who have lived amongst forests for a very long time will tell you that there are better ways to prevent wildfires and then to address wildfires when they do arise. And so by ensuring that there's sufficient money to train Indigenous wildfire firefighters, what we're doing is really getting at the nut of that, which is that for far too long, this country has ignored the wisdom of Indigenous peoples, and it's been a lost opportunity, quite frankly. And I'm looking forward to working more closely with First Nations Indigenous peoples on restoring the knowledge that Indigenous peoples have always had about how to protect themselves and how to protect the forest, quite frankly.
Okay, Patty Hajdu, Canada's Minister of Indigenous Services. I want to thank you for your time on this tonight, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you very much for the time.